At 70, she inherited a house with no keys. Then her German Shepherd uncovered a 50-year-old murder. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as Evelyn Harper drove deeper into the Idaho mountains. At 70, she expected inheritance papers to bring paperwork, not mysteries. But the house waiting for her had no keys, no neighbors, and a strange connection to the father she lost nearly 50 years ago. Then her German Shepherd, Ranger, began stopping at places no one else noticed, places that seemed determined to keep a secret buried forever. Have you ever followed a gut feeling or trusted an animal's instincts when something didn't feel right? There are certain afternoons that seem determined to remind a person how quiet life has become. For Evelyn Harper, those afternoons usually arrived with rain. The rain came often in late autumn outside Spokane. It tapped softly against windows. It collected in gutters. It turned the narrow strip of grass behind her duplex into dark mud. On this particular afternoon, the sky had been gray since morning. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter, holding a chipped blue coffee mug between both hands. The coffee had gone cold nearly 20 minutes earlier, but she hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had. At 70, there were days when she found herself holding things simply because they gave her hands something to do. The duplex was small. One bedroom, one bathroom, a living room barely large enough for an old recliner, a television, and the bookshelf she'd owned since the Carter administration. The furnace rattled whenever it switched on. The refrigerator hummed constantly. And yet most days the loudest sound in the house was silence. Not an unpleasant silence, just a familiar one. The kind that settles around a person gradually over years. Evelyn glanced toward the living room. Ranger was asleep on an aging braided rug near the heater vent. The German Shepherd had turned gray around his muzzle. His hips weren't what they used to be. Rising from the floor now required a little planning. But even asleep, one ear remained tilted upward, listening, always
Hello
listening.
there, my good boy.
Evelyn smiled
Aren't you looking
faintly.
handsome
Still
today?
on duty, huh?
Are you
At the
watching
sound
me?
of her voice, Ranger opened
Such a
one
loyal
eye.
heart.
His tail thumped once against the floor. Then he closed the eye again, satisfied. For the past 9 years, that dog had been her shadow. After the divorce, after retirement, after the house had been sold, after life had become something smaller than she'd once imagined, Ranger had simply stayed. No questions, no conditions, just there. The phone rang. The sharp sound startled both of them. Ranger's head lifted immediately. Evelyn glanced at the wall clock. 2:13. Not her daughter. Carol always called in the evening after work. Probably another insurance offer. Or someone trying to sell replacement windows. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something made her reach for the receiver. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "May I speak with Evelyn Harper?" "This is Evelyn." "Mrs. Harper, my name is Melissa Grant. I'm calling from Fletcher, Klein, and Braddock Attorneys at Law." Evelyn frowned. Law office. That got her attention. She moved toward the kitchen table and sat down. Ranger rose slowly and walked over. Settling beside her chair, the woman continued. "Mrs. Harper, we have been attempting to reach you for several days. There must be some mistake." "I don't believe there is." A brief pause. Then, "We are contacting you regarding the estate of Agnes Whitmore." The name meant almost nothing. Evelyn searched her memory. Whitmore. Whitmore. Somewhere she'd heard it before. Long ago. At a family gathering, perhaps. Or one of those funerals where everyone spent more time discussing distant relatives than remembering the deceased. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said carefully. "Who exactly is Agnes Whitmore?" "She was a relative of yours." The answer wasn't particularly helpful. "How close a relative?" "We believe she was your mother's second cousin." Evelyn blinked. Second cousin. She hadn't known her first cousins particularly well. A second cousin felt practically imaginary, the attorney continued. "Mrs. Whitmore passed away 3 months ago." "I'm sorry to hear that. She left instructions that you be contacted personally regarding the disposition of her property." Now Evelyn sat a little straighter. Property, that word had a way of changing conversations. Not because she expected money. Life had cured her of expecting unexpected fortunes. Still, property was property. What kind of property? The answer arrived so casually she almost missed it. A residence in northern Idaho. Silence. Rain tapped against the window. Ranger shifted beside her chair. Evelyn looked toward the backyard, then back at nothing. A house? Yes. The attorney shuffled papers. Approximately 22 miles outside the town of Black Creek. I think you've called the wrong Evelyn Harper. The woman laughed softly. I assure you we haven't. But I've never met this woman. That may be true. Then why would she leave me a house? I'm afraid I can't answer that. Evelyn leaned back. Nothing about this made sense. She had spent years carefully managing bills, stretching retirement income, selling possessions she no longer needed, and now a stranger had apparently left her a house. It sounded absurd. The attorney continued. There is one unusual condition. Of course there was. There was always a condition. What kind of condition? Another pause, long enough to feel deliberate. Mrs. Whitmore instructed us to transfer ownership exactly as written. Meaning, there are no keys. Evelyn stared at the wall. No keys, correct. Lost keys? No. Copies? No. The locks were changed? No. The attorney lowered her voice slightly. Mrs. Whitmore specifically ordered all keys destroyed. For a moment, Evelyn genuinely wondered if someone was playing a joke. The rain seemed louder suddenly. What exactly does that mean? It means there are no keys. The attorney hesitated. As odd as it sounds, that is precisely what the will says. Evelyn rubbed her forehead. A stranger, a house, no keys. It was the kind of conversation that belonged in a mystery novel, not in the middle of an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I don't think I want any part of this. The words came out before she had fully thought them through, and she meant them, mostly. She was 70 years old. She didn't need complications. She needed predictable grocery bills and manageable property taxes, not mysterious houses in another state. The attorney seemed unsurprised. Many people would feel that way. Then perhaps the house should go to someone else. There is no one else. The words hung there. No one else. Something about them felt unexpectedly sad. The attorney cleared her throat. Mrs. Harper, before you make a decision, perhaps you should review the probate documents. I don't see why. There are several historical references attached to the property file. What kind of references? Records concerning previous visitors to the property. Evelyn sighed. She was already tired, and yet curiosity had begun quietly opening one eye. The same way Ranger did whenever he heard something interesting. The attorney continued. I can email everything immediately. Fine. Please look through it before deciding. I make no promises, of course. The call ended a minute later. The house fell silent again. Only rain. Only the furnace. Only Ranger breathing beside her chair. Evelyn sat there for a long time. Eventually, she opened her laptop. The email had already arrived. Several attachments. Legal documents, survey maps, ownership records, property transfers. Most of it looked exactly as dull as she expected. She skimmed, page after page, names she didn't recognize, dates stretching back decades. Then she stopped. Her hand froze on the mouse. A single line buried inside one of the older documents. Visitor Registry. August 1974, Daniel Harper. The name hit her like a physical thing. Her father. She read it again. Daniel Harper. There was no mistake. No similar spelling, no confusion, just her father's name, printed clearly on a document connected to a property she had never heard of. Her father had been dead for nearly 50 years. Slowly, Evelyn sat back in her chair. The rain continued outside. Ranger rose and rested his head against her knee she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. A house she'd never seen. A woman she barely remembered. A will with no keys, and somehow, her father had been there. For the first time since the phone call began, refusing the inheritance no longer seemed simple. Outside, The afternoon darkened toward evening. Inside, something long dormant had quietly awakened. Not excitement, not hope, just a question. A single question. What had Daniel Harper been doing at that house? And why had nobody ever told her? The question stayed with Evelyn long after darkness settled outside the duplex. She reheated the same cup of coffee twice and never finished it. Rain continued to tap against the windows. Ranger remained beside her chair. Every so often he would glance up, sensing the unusual stillness in her. Dogs noticed things, not thoughts, not memories, but changes, and something had changed. The document remained open on her laptop screen. Visitor Registry. August 1974, Daniel Harper. The name looked exactly the same every time she read it, no matter how often she blinked, no matter how much she wished there might be another explanation. Her father had been connected to the property. Somehow, somewhere, years before his death. Evelyn closed the laptop and leaned back. The ceiling above her kitchen table showed a small water stain near the light fixture. She'd been meaning to ask the landlord about it for months. Instead, she found herself staring at it while memories drifted through her mind. Daniel Harper, tall, broad shoulders, a laugh that always arrived before the joke, the smell of sawdust on his jackets, the way he'd whistle while repairing things around the house. She had been 22 when he died, almost the same age her daughter had been when she left for college. Funny how time worked. One moment a memory felt recent. The next, you realized half a century had passed. Evelyn stood and walked toward the narrow hallway. A small closet sat near the spare room. She hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. The door stuck slightly before finally giving way. Boxes filled the space from floor to ceiling. Some were labeled, most weren't, the accumulation of a lifetime. Things too important to throw away, not important enough to use. Ranger followed immediately. His nails clicked softly across the hardwood floor. "You helping?" she asked. His tail wagged once. That seemed answer enough. The next morning arrived gray and cold. By 9 o'clock, Evelyn was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by old cardboard boxes. Dust floated through thin beams of window light. The room smelled faintly of paper and cedar. She found old Christmas decorations, tax records, school report cards, letters from relatives she'd forgotten existed, an entire box of photographs. Hours slipped past. By noon, she had almost convinced herself she was wasting her time. Then she found the sewing basket. It sat beneath a folded quilt near the back wall, oval-shaped, woven wicker, faded blue lining. The basket had belonged to her mother. Evelyn hadn't seen it in years. She carried it to the living room and placed it on the coffee table. Ranger immediately approached. His nose twitched. Then he sat beside her, watching. The basket contained exactly what she expected. Old thread, needles, buttons sorted into small jars. Patterns folded so many times the creases had become permanent. Nothing unusual, nothing mysterious. She was about to close it when her fingers brushed something beneath the lining. She paused. The bottom felt thicker than it should. Carefully, she lifted the fabric. A hidden compartment, very small, barely noticeable. Inside rested a single photograph. Evelyn frowned. She had never seen it before. Not once. Not in all the years after her mother's death. Not during the move. Not during the divorce. Not during any of the countless afternoons spent sorting possessions. The photograph was old. The edges had yellowed. A crease ran through the center. She turned it over, then froze. Her father looked back at her. Daniel Harper stood beside a large wooden house. The photograph appeared to have been taken decades earlier. The structure sat among towering pines. Its roofline rose sharply against the sky. A wraparound porch stretched across the front. The building looked isolated, remote, almost hidden, and yet Evelyn recognized it immediately. She had never seen the place before yesterday, yet she knew. It was the house Agnes Whitmore had left her. A chill moved through her. The room suddenly felt colder. She studied her father's face. He wasn't smiling. That stood out immediately. Daniel Harper had smiled in nearly every photograph she owned. This one was different. He appeared serious, focused, looking somewhere beyond the camera, as though his attention was fixed on something no one else could see. Slowly, Evelyn turned the photograph over. Handwriting covered the back. For a second, she simply stared. Her father's handwriting. She recognized it instantly. The slightly slanted letters, the distinctive way he crossed his T's, the sharp angle of his capital R. The message was short. Only 7 words. If Ranger ever takes you below the house, trust him. Evelyn read it once, then again. Then a third time, her mouth felt dry. The silence in the room deepened. Ranger, not a dog, not your dog, not someday. Specifically Ranger, the German shepherd sleeping on the rug beside her. The dog currently lifting his head because she had stopped breathing normally. A nervous laugh escaped her. It wasn't amusement, it was confusion. Pure confusion. That's impossible, Ranger blinked. She looked back at the photograph. Her father had nearly 48 years earlier. Ranger was 9. The dog hadn't even existed when Daniel Harper died. No one could have known, no one. Yet there it was, written clearly in black ink. If Ranger ever takes you below the house, trust him. The words refused to make sense, and somehow that made them more disturbing. For the rest of the afternoon, she searched for explanations. Maybe her mother had written it. No. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. Maybe someone added it later. No. The ink age matched the rest of the writing. Maybe Ranger had once belonged to someone connected to Daniel. That made even less sense. Nothing fit. By evening, Evelyn found herself sitting at her computer again. This time, she wasn't reading probate documents. She was researching Agnes Whitmore. The results were surprisingly sparse. No social media, no interviews, no community articles, no photographs, no organization memberships, almost nothing. It was as if Agnes Whitmore had spent decades actively avoiding attention. A few property records appeared. Tax assessments, utility registrations, county maps. The information felt strangely incomplete. One article from nearly 30 years earlier mentioned a wildfire near Black Creek. A property owner named Agnes Whitmore had declined evacuation assistance and remained at her residence throughout the emergency. No photograph, no additional details, just a name. Another record showed she had once served on a historical preservation board. Briefly, then vanished from public records again. The deeper Evelyn searched, the stranger it became. Most people left traces, a photograph, an obituary, a newspaper quote, something. Agnes Whitmore seemed to have left almost nothing, except a house, and now that house belonged to Evelyn. Near 8 o'clock her phone rang. Carol. Right on schedule. Her daughter sounded tired. She always sounded tired these days. Teaching high school history in Seattle apparently required endless energy. They spoke about ordinary things first. The weather, work, a leaking faucet Carol still hadn't fixed. Eventually, Evelyn mentioned the inheritance. Silence followed. Then, a house? Apparently. From somebody you've never met? Apparently. Mom, that sounds suspicious. Evelyn smiled despite herself. That's exactly what I thought. And you're going? I haven't decided. You already decided. Evelyn laughed softly. Maybe she had. Carol knew her too well. What makes you say that? Because you only get that voice when you're curious. What voice? The one that got us lost in Yellowstone. Because you wanted to see where a dirt road ended. Evelyn shook her head. That was 30 years ago. Exactly. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. She didn't mention the note, not yet. She wasn't ready to explain something she couldn't understand herself. After the call ended, she stepped outside onto the small back porch. The rain had finally stopped. The night air carried the scent of wet earth and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across Spokane Valley. Ranger stood beside her, silent, watchful. The porch light illuminated the photograph in her hand. Again she studied the image, the house, her father, the strange message, Below the house, trust him. A dog who hadn't been born for decades. The entire thing felt impossible. Yet the photograph was real. The handwriting was real. And for the first time since receiving the attorney's call, Evelyn felt something stronger than curiosity. She felt pulled, not by the inheritance, not by the property, by the unanswered space surrounding her father's name, a space she had never known existed. Behind her, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the darkness beyond the yard, listening. For several seconds he stood perfectly still. Then the moment passed. He relaxed again. Evelyn looked down at him. The old German shepherd glanced back. And for reasons she could not explain, the message written decades earlier felt a little less impossible than it had that morning. She folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. The house in Idaho had already given her two mysteries: a dead relative who left her everything, and a dead father who somehow seemed to know it was coming. Neither made any sense. But for the first time, Evelyn was certain of one thing. She was going to Black Creek. The decision settled over her more quietly than she expected. No dramatic moment, no speech, no sudden certainty. Just a feeling that had grown stronger with every hour since she'd found the photograph. By sunrise the next morning, she was already making lists: medicine, dog food, extra blankets, flash roadmaps, the practical things, the things people her age learned to think about before long trips. Outside, Spokane wore the faded colors of late autumn. Bare branches rattled in the cold breeze. Low clouds drifted over the city like slow-moving smoke. Ranger followed her from room to room while she packed. He watched every movement, every suitcase, every box, every item loaded near the front door. German shepherds understood departures. Maybe not where, but they knew when. By the third trip to the car, Ranger was already standing beside the passenger door waiting. Evelyn smiled. "Impatient, aren't you?" His tail swept once across the driveway. 3 days later, after final paperwork arrived from the attorneys and arrangements had been made, they left Spokane just after dawn. The city disappeared behind them beneath a pale sky. At first, the drive felt familiar. Traffic, gas stations, chain restaurants, billboards advertising truck stops and casinos. Then gradually the world began to change. The highways narrowed. The towns grew smaller. The distances between buildings widened. The mountains appeared. Dark blue shapes resting against the horizon. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat for most of the trip. Occasionally, he pressed his nose near the window, watching, observing, taking inventory of a landscape neither of them had ever seen. Evelyn found herself doing the same. There was something oddly comforting about driving through unfamiliar country. At 70, most days followed predictable patterns. The same roads, the same grocery store, the same mailbox, the same routines. Now every curve revealed something new. By mid-afternoon, they crossed into northern Idaho. The mountains seemed closer here, steeper, the forests thicker. Pines covered entire hillsides. Long stretches of road passed without another vehicle in sight. Cell service faded in and out. Eventually, it disappeared entirely. Evelyn glanced at her phone. No signal. She wasn't surprised. The attorney had warned her. The property sat in a remote area outside Black Creek. Remote had apparently been an understatement. The farther north she traveled, the more isolated everything became. Old logging equipment rusted beside abandoned clear-cuts. Weathered barns leaned against decades of winter storms. Entire stretches of forest looked untouched by time. As afternoon drifted toward evening, she spotted the first sign for Black Creek. The sign itself looked old, white paint peeling, bullet holes scattered across one corner. Population, 103. Evelyn drove past it. A few minutes later, she entered town. Black Creek consisted of a single main street, one gas station, a hardware store, a small grocery market, a church, several brick buildings that appeared older than the town itself. Nothing moved quickly. Even the traffic seemed relaxed. The place felt detached from the rest of the world. Not abandoned, just forgotten. Evelyn parked beside a diner near the center of town. The building was narrow and old-fashioned. A neon coffee cup glowed in the front window. The sign above the entrance simply read, Mabel's. Ranger climbed out beside her. The cold mountain air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and distant rain. Inside, warmth immediately surrounded them. Coffee, bacon grease, fresh pie. The familiar sense of a small-town diner. Several people glanced up when Evelyn entered, not suspiciously, just curious. Strangers stood out in places like this. A waitress in her 70s approached carrying menus. She had silver hair gathered into a loose bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Table for one?" she asked. Evelyn smiled. "One and a dog." The woman looked down at Ranger. "He's welcome if he behaves. He behaves better than most people." That earned a laugh. They settled into a booth near the window. The waitress returned with coffee. Ranger lay beneath the table. For a while, everything felt ordinary, comfortable. Then the waitress asked the question everyone eventually asks. "You passing through?" "No." Evelyn stirred cream into her coffee. "I inherited a property nearby." The waitress nodded politely. "What property?" Evelyn hesitated, then answered, "The Whitmore place." The reaction was immediate. Small, but unmistakable. The waitress stopped moving, only for a second. Then she resumed wiping the table. "Whitmore," she repeated quietly. "Agnes Whitmore." The woman looked toward the front windows, then toward the counter, then back at Evelyn. Something had changed. Evelyn felt it instantly. The same way people sense a room becoming uncomfortable before anyone says why. "You knew her?" Evelyn asked. The waitress took a long breath. Everybody knew Agnes. That wasn't really an answer. Evelyn waited. The waitress seemed to reconsider whatever she was about to say. Finally, she leaned slightly closer. "You're staying up there?" "I suppose so." The woman glanced toward Ranger, then back at Evelyn. "If I were you," she stopped. The unfinished sentence lingered between them. "If you were me," the waitress lowered her voice. "I wouldn't stay there after dark." Evelyn blinked. The answer was so unexpected she almost laughed. "Why not?" The waitress straightened. Her expression closed immediately. The openness vanished. Gone, just like that. "You'll have to decide that for yourself." Then she walked away. Evelyn watched her disappear behind the counter. The conversation made no sense, yet something about it remained with her. A warning, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply genuine, as if the woman honestly believed she was helping. Half an hour later, Evelyn paid the bill. The waitress accepted the money. Neither mentioned the house again. Outside, daylight was fading. The attorney's map directed her north of town onto a gravel road. The road climbed steadily into the mountains. Pines crowded both sides. Their trunks stood like dark columns in the gathering dusk. Ranger sat upright again, alert, watching. The drive seemed endless. Every few miles, Evelyn checked the map, then checked it again. The farther she traveled, the less certain she felt. No houses, no farms, no signs. Only forest. Then finally she saw it. The first glimpse appeared through the trees, a roofline, dark against the fading sky. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She slowed. The road curved once more, and the house emerged completely. For several seconds, Evelyn simply stared. The photograph had not prepared her. The place was larger than she'd imagined. Older, 3 stories, weathered wood siding, a wraparound porch, tall windows reflecting the final traces of daylight. The structure sat alone among towering pines, as though it had grown there naturally. Exactly like the photograph. Exactly. The same roof, the same porch, the same shape. For a strange moment, it felt less like arriving somewhere new, and more like stepping into a memory that belonged to someone else. Evelyn parked near the front gate. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. Silence settled over the property. Not complete silence. The forest was alive, wind moving through branches, distant crows, the creak of old wood somewhere beyond sight. but there were no human sounds. No voices, no vehicles, nothing. Ranger climbed out beside her. His ears immediately lifted. The dog scanned the property carefully, alert but calm. Evelyn retrieved the envelope containing the legal documents. No keys. The phrase returned to her. No keys. She almost laughed again. Who leaves a house with no keys? The entire thing remained ridiculous. Yet here she was, standing in front of it. The fading daylight painted the upper windows gold. Shadows gathered beneath the porch roof. For a long moment she simply looked, trying to imagine Agnes Whitmore living here, trying to imagine her father standing in the same place 50 years earlier, trying to imagine what connection could possibly exist between them. Then she noticed something. The front door. It wasn't closed, not completely. A narrow, dark gap separated it from the frame. Evelyn froze, maybe an inch, perhaps two, just enough. The door stood slightly open. No broken lock, no splintered wood, no sign of forced entry, nothing. Only an open door waiting in the evening light. Beside her, Ranger became very still. The German shepherd stared directly at the house, not barking, not growling, simply watching. Evelyn felt the unease immediately, a small cold feeling settling somewhere beneath her ribs. The attorney had said there were no keys. The waitress had warned her not to stay after dark. And now the house appeared to have opened itself. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The forest darkened. The open doorway remained, silent, waiting, inviting, or perhaps warning. Evelyn couldn't yet tell which. The front door remained slightly open. The gap looked small from the driveway, smaller than it had a moment ago, as though the darkness inside the house was swallowing it. The evening air had turned colder. A breeze moved through the pines surrounding the property, carrying the smell of damp earth and fallen needles. Beside her, Ranger stood motionless. His eyes never left the doorway. Evelyn looked down at him. The old German shepherd had accompanied her through divorce, financial collapse, medical scares, and lonely winters. She trusted his instincts more than most people's opinions, and right now he was paying very close attention. Not afraid, not aggressive, interested. That somehow felt more unsettling. "Well," she said quietly, mostly to herself, "we've come this far." She picked up her flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering darkness. The porch steps groaned beneath her weight. Old wood, old nails, old age. The house felt tired, but not abandoned. That was the first thing she noticed. A truly abandoned place feels empty. This didn't. The sensation wasn't easy to describe. The house felt aware, as though it had been waiting. The front door moved slightly when she touched it. No resistance, no lock, no chain, nothing. It swung inward with a long, slow creak. Dust drifted through the flashlight beam. The entry hall opened before her. Tall ceilings, dark wooden walls. A staircase climbing toward the second floor. Furniture covered with white sheets. Everything exactly as she imagined an old mountain house might look. And yet, something didn't fit. The smell. Old houses usually smell trapped, stale, sealed. This house didn't. The air carried traces of cedar, dust, and something faintly clean, as though somebody occasionally opened windows or visited. Evelyn stepped inside. Ranger followed immediately. The floorboards creaked softly beneath them. The beam from her flashlight moved across framed photographs hanging on the walls. Most were too dark to identify. Portraits, landscapes, family pictures, generations of strangers watching from dusty frames. The silence felt enormous. No traffic, no television, no distant neighbors. Nothing. Only the house settling around them. After several minutes, she found the main breaker panel near the kitchen. To her surprise, electricity still worked. The lights flickered, then came alive. Soft yellow illumination spread through the lower floor. The sudden brightness made everything seem slightly less threatening. Slightly, not completely. Ranger immediately began exploring. Nose low, ears alert, moving carefully from room to room. Evelyn opened windows, checked plumbing, examined cabinets. The practical tasks helped settle her nerves. The kitchen contained canned goods, decades old. The dining room held heavy oak furniture beneath sheets. A study overlooked the forest. Every room told part of a story. Yet none of them explained Agnes Whitmore. No photographs identified her. No personal letters sat on tables. No clues, only absence. Hours passed. Eventually darkness consumed the valley outside. The forest beyond the windows became a wall of black. Evelyn heated soup from a thermos she had packed that morning. Ranger accepted part of a sandwich. Then both settled into the living room. The firewood stacked beside the stone fireplace appeared relatively recent. Not fresh, but not decades old either. Someone had restocked it within the last year. Another thing that didn't fit. Near midnight, she finally prepared to sleep. She chose a downstairs bedroom rather than risk unfamiliar stairs in the dark. Ranger settled beside the bed. Within minutes, she drifted asleep. Then came the scratching. Her eyes opened instantly. Silence, darkness. The digital clock beside the bed read 2:17 a.m. She listened. Nothing. Then it came in again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Not outside, inside the house. Ranger was already awake, standing, alert. The sound came from somewhere below them. A pause, then again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Evelyn grabbed the flashlight. Ranger moved toward the hallway immediately. The sound stopped before they reached the basement door. Complete silence returned. She opened the door. The basement stairs descended into darkness. Cold air drifted upward. Ranger stared down the staircase, every muscle focused, waiting. After nearly a minute, Evelyn switched off the flashlight. Nothing else happened. Eventually, they returned upstairs. But sleep came harder after that. The following morning revealed low clouds hanging across the valley. The house looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more worn. Coffee helped. So did routine. By late morning, she began a more thorough inspection of the property. That was when she found the footprints. The rear entrance sat near an overgrown garden. Rain had fallen heavily 2 nights earlier. The soil remained soft. At first, she almost missed them. Then she saw the impressions, boot prints, recent, distinct. Someone had walked near the back entrance after the rain. Not decades ago, not months ago. Recently, within days. Evelyn crouched carefully. The prints led toward the tree line, then disappeared among fallen leaves. A chill crept through her. Somebody had been here. The question was simple. Who and why? Ranger sniffed the ground briefly, then turned away, as if the footprints weren't what interested him. The basement was. Over the next 2 days, a pattern emerged. No matter where they explored, Ranger eventually returned to the same location. The basement, specifically the far western corner, a stone wall partially hidden behind old shelves. He scratched at it, whined at it, sometimes simply sat facing it, watching, waiting. The behavior became impossible to ignore. Evidently, you've found something. Ranger responded by placing one paw against the wall. The gesture looked almost deliberate. Evelyn examined the stonework. Nothing obvious. No hidden door. No loose stones. No handles. Just old foundation rock. Still, the dog refused to let it go. On the 3rd afternoon, another thing happened. A pickup truck drove slowly past the property. Evelyn noticed it through the front window. Dark green, older model, local plates. The driver didn't stop, didn't wave, didn't appear lost. The truck simply rolled past. An hour later it returned. Same speed, same direction, then disappeared again. By evening it had passed 3 times. Ranger noticed it too. Each time he rose and moved toward the windows, watching. The next morning brought a visitor. The sound of tires crunching gravel pulled Evelyn onto the porch. A different truck this time. County vehicle. A man climbed out. Tall, broad-shouldered, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair beneath a weathered baseball cap, the kind of face carved by decades of outdoor life. He approached with calm confidence. Not threatening. Not friendly either. Simply deliberate. Evelyn Harper? She nodded. The man extended his hand. Curtis Vance. His grip was firm. Retired sheriff. Something about the introduction felt rehearsed, as though he'd practiced it on the drive over. You knew Agnes Whitmore? Curtis looked toward the house. Long time ago. His answer came too quickly, too carefully. Evelyn noticed. Years of dealing with contractors and clients had taught her how to recognize when somebody was selecting words. This man was selecting everyone. "What can I do for you?" she asked. Curtis removed his gloves, folded them slowly, looked toward the forest, then back at her. "I heard somebody inherited the place. Word traveled fast in small towns, apparently very fast." "I did," he nodded. Another long pause. Then finally, "You planning to keep it?" The question felt strangely important to him. "I'm still deciding." "Sell it." The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No explanation. Just sell it. Evelyn studied him. "Why?" Curtis smiled. Not warmly, not coldly. A practiced smile. "The property's isolated." He gestured toward the surrounding mountains. "Hard winters. Expensive upkeep. Plenty of buyers interested in land out here." The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something felt wrong. The concern didn't feel genuine. It felt prepared, like a speech. One delivered before. Maybe many times. Ranger stepped onto the porch, immediately positioning himself beside Evelyn. The old shepherd stared directly at Curtis, not growling, not barking, watching. Curtis noticed. His smile faded slightly. "Good dog." Ranger didn't move. Several uncomfortable seconds passed. Then Curtis cleared his throat. "If you decide to sell, folks around here can help." Another pause. "Don't stay too attached to the place." The statement landed oddly. Not advice, almost a warning. Evelyn felt it immediately. So did Ranger. The dog took one step forward. Curtis glanced down at him. Something flickered across the retired sheriff's face. Recognition? Nervousness? Evelyn couldn't tell, but she saw it, just for a moment. Then it vanished. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Curtis returned to his truck. The engine started. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, and within seconds he was gone. Evelyn remained on the porch, watching the empty road. The valley had become very quiet again. Far too quiet. Behind her, Ranger nudged her hand. She looked down. The German shepherd immediately turned toward the basement door, then looked back at her, as if reminding her, the wall, the basement, the place he refused to leave alone. Evelyn followed his gaze, and for the first time a thought formed clearly. Maybe whatever Agnes Whitmore had spent her life hiding wasn't hidden very far away. The thought followed Evelyn down the basement stairs. The old wooden steps creaked beneath her weight. Ranger moved ahead of her immediately. Purposeful, certain. The same certainty he had shown for days. The basement air felt cooler than the rest of the house. Stone walls trapped the mountain chill. A single hanging bulb illuminated part of the room, leaving the far corners buried in shadow. The western wall waited exactly where it always had. Nothing about it appeared unusual. Just old stone, old mortar, old foundation work. Yet Ranger walked directly toward it. He placed both front paws against the wall and scratched. Once, twice, then again. The sound echoed through the basement. Evelyn studied the surface. Carefully this time, she brought tools, a flashlight, a hammer, a pry bar from the garage, and most importantly, patience. At 70, she had learned that many mysteries surrendered themselves slowly. She examined every inch of the stonework. Most of it looked consistent. Then she noticed something, a slight difference in coloration. Not obvious, not dramatic, but visible once she saw it. The stones near the center appeared newer, the mortar joints slightly cleaner, as if that section had been repaired years after the rest. Ranger whined softly. The sound made the hairs rise on her arms. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see what you're trying so hard to show me." The pry bar slid into a narrow crack. She pushed. Nothing. She adjusted the angle, pushed again. A faint movement, barely noticeable, but enough. The stone shifted. Evelyn froze, then pushed harder. Dust spilled downward. Mortar crumbled. Another stone loosened. Then another. Her pulse quickened. The work took nearly an hour. By the end, sweat dampened her color despite the cold basement air. Finally, an opening appeared. Small at first, then large enough to reveal darkness beyond. Not solid foundation, a space. Hidden. Evelyn sat back on her heels. For several seconds, neither she nor Ranger moved. The silence felt enormous. Then Ranger stepped forward. Without hesitation, without fear. The German shepherd slipped through the opening. His nails clicked against concrete somewhere beyond the wall. Evelyn grabbed the flashlight. Ranger. The beam cut through the darkness. A narrow, concealed room stretched between the original foundation and an interior wall added decades later. Not large, perhaps 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, completely hidden from anyone who didn't know it existed. Dust covered everything. But unlike the rest of the basement, this dust felt undisturbed, protected, preserved, waiting. Shelves lined the walls. Metal filing cabinets stood in one corner. Several wooden crates occupied another. A folding table sat beneath a cloth sheet yellowed by age. The room smelled of paper, old paper. The smell of archives, the smell of forgotten years. Ranger sat beside the table, waiting, as if his job was finished. Evelyn approached slowly. Her flashlight illuminated the objects one by one. Journals, boxes of photographs, cassette tapes, survey maps, folders. Hundreds of pages of carefully organized records. Every item labeled, every item dated. Whoever created this room had not hidden random possessions. They had built an archive, a deliberate archive. The first name she saw stopped her cold. Daniel Harper, her father. The label appeared on a box resting near the center shelf. She stared. The room suddenly felt smaller, the silence deeper. With trembling fingers, she opened the box. Inside rested newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes, county reports, old correspondence, all connected to a single event, the death of Daniel Harper. Evelyn lowered herself into a chair. For several moments, she could only stare. She had spent nearly 50 years believing she knew the story. Everyone knew the story. Daniel Harper died in a hunting accident. Simple, tragic, finished. That was the version she had lived with. The version printed in newspapers. The version repeated at family gatherings. The version that became accepted truth. Now she wasn't so sure. The first newspaper article looked familiar. She remembered seeing it after the funeral. The headline described an accidental shooting during a remote hunting trip. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Then she noticed another article beneath it, published 6 weeks later. Different details, different statements. One witness quoted differently. A timeline that no longer matched the original report. She frowned. That happened sometimes. Journalists made mistakes. Memories changed. But then she found another document, and another, and another. A pattern began to emerge. Statements had changed. Dates had shifted. Descriptions no longer aligned. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic individually. Together they became impossible to ignore. Evelyn opened one of the journals. The handwriting belonged to Agnes Whitmore. Neat, precise, methodical. The first entry she read was dated 1981. Nearly 7 years after Daniel's death. I requested copies of the sheriff's records again. 3 pages remain missing. Missing. The word lingered. Evelyn turned pages. Dozens of entries followed. Years of investigation, years of persistence, years of questions. Agnes had documented everything. Every conversation, every interview, every contradiction, every missing document. The deeper Evelyn read, the stranger the story became. One witness originally reported hearing 2 gunshots. Later records mentioned only 1. A map from the accident scene no longer matched updated county records. Evidence logs referenced items that no longer appeared in storage inventories. Entire sections had vanished, not lost, removed. The distinction mattered. Ranger lay quietly beside her chair, watching. The old dog seemed content now, as though he knew she had finally reached the place he wanted her to find. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, Afternoon light shifted across the basement windows. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Evelyn barely noticed. She continued reading, continued uncovering, continued descending into a story she had never known existed. Near the bottom drawer of one filing cabinet, she found a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, Agnes had written, "Original county report. Copy preserved before alteration." Evelyn's breath caught. Carefully, she opened it. Inside rested photocopies, official documents, sheriff's records, photographs from the original scene. Several pages immediately stood out. Large portions had been marked with handwritten notes from Agnes, removed from later versions. Missing in public file. Witness statement changed. No explanation provided. The evidence felt overwhelming. Not proof, not yet. But something. Something significant. Something wrong. The accident report she remembered from childhood suddenly looked incomplete, like a story with pages torn out. By evening, she reached the final shelf. There she discovered a large binder. Its spine contained only 2 words, "Working Theory." Evelyn opened it. The first page contained a timeline. The second listed names. The third outlined inconsistencies Agnes had tracked for decades. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Agnes had underlined it twice. "I no longer believe Daniel Harper died by accident." Evelyn stared at the words. The room seemed to fall silent around her. No wind, no creaking boards, no distant sounds from the forest. Only those words. "I no longer believe Daniel Harper died by accident." She read the paragraph beneath. Agnes never claimed certainty. She never claimed proof, but she listed reasons. Too many contradictions. Too many missing records. Too many altered statements. Too many people unwilling to speak. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the page. "If Daniel discovered what I believe he discovered, motive existed." Evelyn slowly closed the binder. Her hands felt cold, her heart heavier. Across nearly 50 years she had carried grief. But grief was different from doubt. And now doubt had entered the room. The possibility settled over her like a storm cloud. Not certainty, not yet. Something more dangerous. A question. A question that could no longer be ignored. What if her father had never died in an accident? Ranger lifted his head. The old German shepherd looked at her quietly. Neither moved for several seconds. Then Evelyn glanced back at the shelves. The journals, the reports, the photographs. The decades of work Agnes Whitmore had hidden behind a basement wall. The inheritance had never been about the house. For the first time, she understood that. The house was simply the doorway. This room was the real inheritance. And somewhere inside these boxes lay the reason Agnes Whitmore spent half her life preserving secrets no one else wanted remembered. As darkness settled beyond the basement windows, Evelyn looked once more at the binder resting in her lap. The official story was no longer enough, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, she allowed herself to consider something she had never imagined possible. Her father may have been murdered. The thought followed Evelyn everywhere, through breakfast, through long walks around the property, through sleepless hours staring at the bedroom ceiling while mountain winds moved through the trees outside. Once the possibility existed, it refused to leave. The evidence Agnes had gathered filled nearly every room downstairs now. Boxes sat open across the dining table. Photographs covered countertops. Maps lay unrolled beneath paperweights and coffee mugs. The house no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by questions. Ranger seemed calmer since the hidden room had been discovered, as if finding the archive had completed one task. Yet another behavior had begun to emerge. Whenever Evelyn mentioned certain names while reading aloud from Agnes's journals, Ranger remained indifferent. But one name consistently drew his attention: Warren Hale. The reaction was subtle at first. An ear lifting, his head turning. A moment of unusual focus. The first time it happened, Evelyn dismissed it. The second time, she noticed. By the 4th or 5th occurrence, she couldn't ignore it. Warren Hale, she read from one journal entry. Immediately, Ranger looked up, his eyes fixed on her, alert, watching. Evelyn lowered the notebook. That's strange. The dog remained still, listening, then slowly settled back down. The behavior lingered in her thoughts. Just another thing that didn't fit. And the list of things that didn't fit was becoming very long. 3 days later, she drove into Black Creek, determined to speak with people who might still remember Daniel Harper. The town looked much the same as before. Gray clouds drifted over the valley. Pickup trucks lined Main Street. A flag moved lazily outside the post office. Life continued. Quiet, ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, Evelyn had begun to suspect something else existed. Something people preferred not to discuss. Her first conversations led nowhere. The owner of the grocery store remembered her father only vaguely. A mechanic claimed he had moved to town years after Daniel's death. An elderly man outside the hardware store simply shook his head and walked away when she mentioned the accident. Not angry, not frightened, just unwilling. That response bothered her more than open hostility would have. People avoided topics for reasons, and this topic was clearly being avoided. By mid-afternoon, she was considering giving up for the day when the woman at the library pointed her toward a retired schoolteacher. Try Ruth McKenna. The librarian lowered her voice slightly. If anyone still remembers those years, it's Ruth. The small white house sat near the edge of town. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows despite the season. A wind chime moved softly beneath the porch roof. When Evelyn knocked, the woman who answered appeared to be in her 80s, thin, sharp-eyed, alert, the kind of person who missed very little. "Evelyn Harper," Ruth said before introductions were complete. The recognition surprised her. "You know who I am?" Ruth studied her face, then nodded. "You look like Daniel." The words landed harder than Evelyn expected. For a moment she couldn't speak. Ruth opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The house smelled faintly of tea and old books. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Generations of students, families, community events. A lifetime recorded in frames. Ruth poured tea, then sat across from Evelyn at a small kitchen table. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence felt respectful, measured. Finally, Ruth broke it. "You found Agnes's records." It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded. "How did you know?" "Because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be here." Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. Ruth stared into her teacup. "When Agnes died, I wondered how long it would take." Take for what? For somebody to ask the questions she never stopped asking. Evelyn leaned forward. "My father." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "You want the truth. I want whatever you know." The older woman looked toward the window, toward the mountains beyond town. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, not louder, heavier. "The accident never made sense." Evelyn's pulse quickened. Why? Because Daniel wasn't investigating hunting trails. The answer came immediately. Certain, unequivocal. Ruth had been waiting years to say it. He was investigating land records. The room fell silent. Evelyn frowned. "Land records?" Ruth nodded. "Ownership transfers, property boundaries, county filings." He spent nearly 2 years studying them. None of this matched the father she remembered. Or perhaps it did. Just not the part she had known. Ruth continued. Daniel believed public land was being transferred into private hands through forged documents. Evelyn stared. What kind of land? Timberland, water access, grazing rights. The kind of land worth millions over time. The pieces began shifting, slowly, dangerously. Agnes's journals, missing records, altered reports. A man who died while asking questions. "What happened?" Evelyn asked. Ruth sighed. "Daniel got too close." The answer was simple, yet terrifying. The wind outside seemed louder suddenly. Did he tell anyone? Agnes. Ruth didn't hesitate. Agnes was helping him. The statement connected decades of mystery instantly. Suddenly, Agnes Whitmore wasn't just a distant relative. She was part of whatever Daniel had discovered. part of whatever followed. Ruth stood and walked toward a bookshelf. After a moment, she returned holding a faded photograph. The edges had curled with age. She handed it to Evelyn. 3 men stood beside a fence line. One was Daniel Younger, smiling, alive. The second man was unfamiliar. The third made Evelyn pause. Tall, confident, broad-shouldered, the expression of someone accustomed to being respected. Ruth tapped the photograph. Warren Hale, the name again. The same name that appeared repeatedly throughout Agnes's journals. The same name that caught Ranger's attention. He knew my father? Ruth gave a sad smile. Knew him? She shook her head. They were practically brothers. The words hit harder than anything else she'd heard. Friends. Not strangers. Not rivals. Friends. The revelation changed everything. Because betrayal carried a different weight when trust came first. Ruth studied Evelyn carefully. There was a time nobody in this valley trusted Warren more. People still trust him now. Evelyn remembered the community newsletters she'd seen, the charity events, the sponsorship plaques, the ranch, the reputation, the image. Ruth nodded slowly. That's the problem. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Finally, Evelyn asked the question she feared most. Do you think Warren Hale had something to do with my father's death? Ruth looked down. Old grief crossed her face, not fresh grief, the kind worn smooth by decades. I think your father discovered something. She paused. And I think certain people benefited when he stopped asking questions. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly past the house. Neither woman acknowledged it, but both noticed. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Not because there was nothing left to say, because there was too much. As Evelyn walked back toward her SUV, she felt the story changing shape again. The accident was no longer isolated. It wasn't just about a dead hunter in the mountains. It was connected to land, money, power, documents, people. And at the center of it, all stood one name, Warren Hale. The drive back to the property took nearly 40 minutes. Ranger met her at the door. The old German shepherd immediately sniffed her coat, then stepped back, watching. Evidently, we learned something today. The dog tilted his head. Evelyn laughed softly, then reached for Agnes's journals. Hours later, after darkness settled over the valley, she found another entry mentioning Warren Hale. This time, Ranger reacted immediately, not just attention. A low rumble, barely audible, the first growl she had heard from him since arriving in Idaho. Evelyn froze. The sound lasted only a second, then disappeared. But it had happened. She looked down. Ranger was staring toward the front windows, toward the darkness outside, toward something beyond the glass. Slowly, Evelyn approached. The yard appeared empty. The forest stood silent beneath moonlight. Nothing moved, nothing visible. Yet Ranger remained focused, watching, waiting. And for the first time since arriving at the house, Evelyn felt something stronger than suspicion. She felt certainty. Somewhere inside this valley, hidden beneath decades of silence and reputation, lay the reason Daniel Harper never came home. And whatever that reason was, Ranger seemed to sense it long before she did. The storm arrived 2 days later. It rolled over the mountains during the night, not suddenly, slowly, like something gathering strength. By dawn, rain hammered the roof of the old house. Wind bent the tops of the pines. Clouds swallowed the valley completely. From the front porch, Evelyn could barely see beyond the nearest tree line. The world had shrunk to rain, fog, and the constant sound of water. The weather trapped her at the property. The gravel roads leading toward Black Creek would become dangerous if conditions worsened. For the first time since arriving, she had nowhere to go. Nothing to do except continue reading. So she did, hour after hour. Agnes's journals filled the dining table. Legal records covered the floor. Photographs sat in careful rows across the kitchen counter. Ranger moved between rooms quietly, occasionally checking windows, occasionally returning to sit beside her. The old German shepherd seemed perfectly content. The storm had transformed the house into a world of its own. By the second day, Evelyn began noticing something she had previously overlooked. A pattern. Not in the documents. In the names, certain names appeared once. Others appeared occasionally. One appeared everywhere. Warren Hale. The name surfaced repeatedly in journals, in notes, in interviews, in copied land records, sometimes only in passing, sometimes entire pages focused on him. At first, Agnes seemed uncertain. Later entries became increasingly specific and increasingly concerned. Evelyn opened a journal dated 18 years after Daniel's death. The entry was heavily underlined. If Warren is innocent, why does every missing document eventually pass through a person connected to him? The sentence lingered in the room. Rain rattled the windows. The fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. Ranger slept beside the hearth. Evelyn continued reading. More references appeared. Witnesses refusing interviews after speaking with Warren. Property transfers involving Warren's associates. Records disappearing from county offices. Agnes never accused him directly, but the suspicion became impossible to miss. By evening, Evelyn found herself staring at an old photograph. Daniel Harper stood beside Warren Hale. Both smiling, both younger, both wearing work clothes, friends, real friends, not acquaintances, not neighbors, friends. The realization hurt more than she expected. Betrayal always felt worse when trust came first. She wondered how many fishing trips they had taken together, how many meals shared, how many promises exchanged. Then she remembered Ruth McKenna's words. They were practically brothers. The thought settled heavily inside her. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. The storm intensified. That night she slept poorly. Sometime after midnight, Ranger woke her, not barking, just standing beside the bed. Watching, waiting. The behavior was familiar now. Whenever he believed something required attention, he simply refused to leave. Evelyn sat up. All right. The dog turned immediately, then walked toward the back door. She followed. Rain still fell, not as heavily as before, but enough. Ranger stood at the glass, focused, looking toward the darkness beyond the yard. Evelyn followed his gaze. At first she saw nothing. Then she noticed a faint shape. A distant structure partially visible through the trees. She frowned. She hadn't explored that direction yet. The next morning, despite lingering drizzle, Ranger led her there. The walk took nearly 20 minutes. The forest floor was soaked. Pine needles softened every step. The air smelled clean and cold. Eventually the trees opened. A weathered structure stood ahead, an old barn, or what remained of one. The roof sagged badly. Sections of siding had collapsed. Nature had begun reclaiming it. Yet traces of human history remained. Evelyn stopped. The property felt familiar somehow. Not because she'd been there, because she'd seen it. In one of Agnes's photographs, Ranger moved ahead. His pace quickened. The old shepherd suddenly looked years younger, purposeful, driven. He circled the structure once, then disappeared through a gap in the wall. Evidently, you've found something. Evelyn ducked inside. The interior smelled of wet wood and rust. Light entered through holes in the roof. Dust drifted through pale beams of sunlight. The place had been abandoned for decades. Yet not everything inside was random. A rear storage room remained mostly intact. Old shelves lined the walls. Crates sat beneath tarps, and Ranger stood in front of a rusted metal locker, waiting, his nose pressed against the door, his tail motionless, focused. Evelyn approached. The lock had long since corroded away. The door opened with little effort. Inside rested several items. A lantern, a toolbox, an old canvas hunting jacket. She almost closed the locker. Then something caught her eye. Dark stains near one sleeve. Age had faded them considerably, yet they remained visible. A small evidence tag had been attached to the collar. The paper had yellowed. The ink nearly disappeared, but not completely. Evelyn carefully lifted it. Her pulse quickened. Property recovery. Item October 1974, the same year Daniel died, the same year as the hunting accident. She sat down slowly on an overturned crate. The barn suddenly felt colder. Ranger remained beside the locker, watching her, waiting. The jacket alone proved nothing, absolutely nothing, but combined with everything else. The journals, the missing records, the altered statements, the land transfers, the friendship, the timing, the evidence continued pointing in one direction, toward one man. Warren Hale outside. Wind moved through the trees. The sound resembled distant whispers. Evelyn looked around the abandoned structure. More clues emerged. Old feed invoices, property markers, survey equipment, several documents bearing the Hale Ranch branding. This place had once belonged to Warren. No question. The realization settled over her slowly. The respected ranch owner, the community sponsor, the man whose name appeared on scholarship plaques and charity banners. The man nearly everyone trusted. Agnes had spent decades quietly documenting connections leading back to him. Not because he looked suspicious, because he didn't. That was what made it dangerous. By the time Evelyn and Ranger returned to the house, evening shadows stretched across the valley. The storm finally began moving east. Clouds broke apart. For the first time in days, sunlight reached the mountains. Golden light spilled across the pines. Beautiful, peaceful, deceptive. Evelyn carried the hunting jacket into the hidden archive room. She placed it beside Agnes's records, then opened another journal. This one contained a photograph clipped between two pages. The image showed Daniel and Warren standing together outside a county building. Both smiling, both unaware of the future waiting for them. On the back, Agnes had written a single sentence. The hardest truths are often hidden behind familiar faces. Evelyn stared at the photograph for a long time, then slowly turned it over. The date written beneath the image stopped her cold. It had been taken only 3 weeks before Daniel died. 3 weeks. That was all. 3 weeks between friendship and tragedy. 3 weeks between trust and whatever followed. Across the room, Ranger lifted his head. The old German shepherd was staring toward the front windows again, toward the road, toward the darkness gathering outside. Evelyn followed his gaze. Nothing moved, no vehicles, no people, no visible threat. Yet the feeling remained. Something was getting closer. And for the first time since arriving in Idaho, Evelyn no longer wondered who Agnes suspected. She knew. The evidence wasn't complete. Not yet. But the direction was unmistakable. The man everyone trusted had become the man she feared most. And somewhere beneath decades of reputation, influence, and carefully maintained respectability, the truth was waiting. The realization stayed with Evelyn through the next several days. The storm had passed, blue sky returned, sunlight spilled across the valley. Yet the beauty surrounding the property felt strangely disconnected from what she now knew. Every morning she walked onto the porch with a cup of coffee. Every morning the mountains appeared peaceful, and every morning she found herself thinking about forged records, missing evidence, a dead father, and Warren Hale. The contrast felt impossible. The valley looked like the sort of place where nothing bad should happen. Perhaps that was exactly why things had. People trusted appearances. Agnes's journals made that painfully clear. 3 mornings after discovering the hunting barn, Ranger began acting strangely again. The behavior reminded Evelyn of the days before he found the hidden room. Restless, focused, persistent, he kept circling the southern edge of the property. Not wandering, following something, a path, an idea, a scent. Evelyn couldn't tell which. By noon, he had returned to the same location 4 times. A patch of ground hidden beneath thick brush near a slope overlooking the valley. The place appeared completely ordinary. Wild grass, fallen branches, old stones, nothing unusual. Yet Ranger refused to leave it alone. He pawed at the earth, walked several yards away, returned, repeated the process. Finally, Evelyn grabbed gloves and pruning shears. "All right." Ranger immediately stepped aside, watching, waiting. The brush proved denser than it appeared. Thorns caught her sleeves. Dead branches snapped beneath her boots. The work took nearly an hour. Then she found it, a rusted metal pipe protruding from the hillside, only 6 inches visible, almost completely hidden. At first, she assumed it was part of an old drainage system. Then she noticed the opening, dark, hollow, large enough for air to move through. She knelt. Cold air drifted outward, not from soil, from somewhere deeper. Ranger moved beside her. His ears lifted. The old shepherd stared directly into the darkness. The same expression he'd worn in the basement, the same certainty. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She returned to the house, gathered flashlights, rope, a first aid kit, water. The practical habits of someone who had spent enough years learning not to underestimate hidden places. The opening widened after several more minutes of clearing debris. What emerged wasn't a pipe, it was an entrance, a tunnel, small, concealed, almost invisible beneath decades of growth. The discovery sent a chill through her. Agnes had mentioned tunnels repeatedly throughout her journals. Not often, but enough. References scattered through dozens of entries. Never explained, never fully described, only hints. The old route remains secure. The southern access point remains undiscovered. Storage remains intact. At the time, those entries made little sense. Now they did. Ranger entered first, not far. Just enough to confirm the space was passable. Then he looked back. Waiting, Evelyn followed. The tunnel descended gradually beneath the hillside. The air smelled of damp stone and earth. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The flashlight beam revealed reinforced sections of old concrete mixed with natural rock. Not ancient, not modern, something in between. The passage continued farther than she expected. Several times she considered turning back. Then she remembered Daniel, Agnes, 48 years of silence, and she kept moving. After nearly 15 minutes, the tunnel widened. A chamber appeared ahead, small, dry, protected from the elements. The flashlight swept across the room, then stopped. Metal storage containers, several of them, stacked carefully against one wall. Evelyn stood motionless. The feeling that followed wasn't excitement, it was recognition. Agnes had built this. Agnes had hidden this. Agnes had intended someone to find it. Eventually, Ranger walked directly toward the nearest container. His nose touched the rusted lid. Then he sat. The old German shepherd's work was becoming difficult to ignore. Every major discovery had begun with him. Every single one. Evelyn carefully opened the first container. Inside rested waterproof document sleeves, photographs, property maps, audio tapes, folders, dozens upon dozens of folders. The second container held more, the third even more. An entire archive, larger than the hidden room beneath the house, more focused, more deliberate. This wasn't research. This was evidence. For the next several hours, she worked beneath the tunnel lights, opening files, organizing materials, building timelines. The picture finally began coming together. Daniel Harper had uncovered a land fraud operation spanning years. Public timberlands had been transferred illegally, ownership records altered, boundaries manipulated, profits redirected. The scheme touched multiple individuals. But one name appeared more often than any other: Warren Hale. The documents grew increasingly specific, increasingly direct. Photographs showed original property surveys beside altered versions. Financial records linked several transactions to shell partnerships controlled by Hale. Witness statements referenced closed-door meetings, pressure, threats, disappearances of records. The evidence felt overwhelming. Then she found the cassette. Unlike the others, it carried a handwritten label. Recorded statement, J.T. Lawson, 1992. Evelyn stared at it. The name appeared in several journals. One of Warren Hale's former business associates. A man who had left the valley abruptly decades earlier. Agnes had interviewed him. The tape recorder took several attempts to function. Eventually, static filled the chamber. Then a voice emerged. Old, tired, nervous J.T. Lawson. The recording quality was poor, yet the words came through clearly enough. He described the land transfers, The forged documents, the money, the fear. Then his voice changed, slower, heavier, as though approaching something he had spent years avoiding. Daniel found out. Silence followed. Several seconds. Then Lawson continued. He wasn't supposed to find out that much. Another pause. He said he was going public. The tape crackled. Static interrupted portions of the recording. Then came the sentence that stopped Evelyn's breathing. The hunting trip wasn't an accident. The chamber seemed to shrink around her. She sat completely still, listening. Lawson's voice continued. Not dramatic, not emotional, just exhausted, like a man finally putting down something heavy. He explained that Daniel's death had been planned. Not by strangers, not by random criminals, by people protecting the fraud operation. Daniel had become a threat, a problem. Someone who intended to expose everything. The tape never described violence in detail. It didn't need to. The implication was devastating enough. The accident had been staged. The official story had been manufactured. The cover-up had followed immediately afterward. When the recording ended, silence returned. Only the distant sound of dripping water remained. Evelyn sat motionless. The flashlight rested across her knees. Ranger moved closer. His head settled gently against her leg. For a long time she couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't move, because the question was gone now. For weeks she had chased a possibility, a suspicion, a theory. Now that uncertainty had vanished. The answer sat inside a rusted container beneath a mountain, preserved for decades, waiting. Agnes Whitmore had spent nearly 50 years protecting it. The truth, the real truth, not rumor, not speculation, truth. Eventually, Evelyn opened the final container. Inside rested a sealed, waterproof folder. Across the front, Agnes had written one sentence. For Evelyn, Final Evidence Archive. Her hands trembled slightly. Inside were photographs, signed statements, property records, and a note. The note was brief. If you are reading this, Ranger succeeded. Evelyn stared at the words. A strange laugh escaped her. Half disbelief, half emotion. Because somehow Agnes had known. Not the dog, not his name. But she had known someone loyal would eventually guide the right person here. The note continued. The final proof is enclosed. Protect it, then tell the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The final documents confirmed everything Lawson had described. Every missing piece, every unanswered question, every doubt. By the time Evelyn emerged from the tunnel, the sun had already begun setting. Golden light stretched across the valley. The mountains glowed orange and red. The world looked unchanged, yet everything had changed. She stood beside the hidden entrance, the evidence secured in a backpack, Ranger at her side. The wind moved gently through the pines. For nearly 50 years, people had called Daniel Harper's death an accident. Now that lie no longer had anywhere left to hide. And for the first time since arriving in Idaho, Evelyn wasn't searching for answers anymore. She had found them. The hunting accident had never been an accident. Her father's death had been intentional, and Agnes Whitmore had spent half a lifetime making certain the truth would survive long enough to be found. For a long time after leaving the tunnel, Evelyn sat alone on the porch. The backpack containing Agnes's final archive rested beside her chair. Ranger lay at her feet. The valley stretched quietly before them. Pine-covered ridges, golden evening light, long shadows drifting across open meadows. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same. The uncertainty was gone. For weeks she had been chasing questions. Now she carried answers. Answers she had spent nearly 50 years believing she would never find. The realization should have brought relief. Instead, it brought something heavier. Grief. Not fresh grief, old grief. The kind that had been sitting silently inside her for decades, waiting. The pain of losing her father had never disappeared. It had simply become part of the landscape of her life. Like a mountain in the distance. Always there, always visible. Sometimes forgotten, never gone. That night she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel Harper. Not as he died, as he lived, teaching her to cast a fishing line, helping her ride a bicycle, laughing at the dinner table, the ordinary moments, the important ones, the moments murder had stolen. Morning arrived gray and quiet. A thin layer of fog drifted through the valley. Ranger was already awake, watching the front windows, as usual. Evelyn made coffee, then returned to the archive. The final folder contained dozens of documents she had not yet reviewed. She worked slowly, carefully. Hours passed. The deeper she went, the more complete Agnes's investigation became. Property records, affidavits, witness interviews, financial statements, photographic evidence. Everything necessary to reopen the case. Everything necessary to expose the truth. Then she found something she hadn't expected. A small cassette tape. Unlike the others, this one was sealed inside a separate plastic sleeve. A note had been attached. Agnes's handwriting appeared across the front. For Evelyn, when you are ready, nothing else. Her heartbeat quickened. She stared at the tape for several seconds. Something about it felt different, important, personal, almost sacred. Ranger lifted his head from the rug, watching her, as though he sensed it too. The tape recorder from the tunnel still sat on the dining room table. Evelyn carried the cassette over. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, from anticipation. She inserted the tape, pressed play. Static filled the room. The old machine crackled softly. Several seconds passed. Then a voice emerged. A man's voice, calm, steady, familiar. Evelyn stopped breathing. Her coffee cup slipped slightly in her hand. The voice continued. Hello, Evie. The room vanished. The years vanished. The mountains vanished. Everything disappeared except that voice. Daniel Harper, her father. For nearly 50 years she had not heard it. Not once. No recordings, no videos, no messages, only memories. And now suddenly he was there, speaking. Alive inside the sound, her eyes filled immediately. She didn't try to stop it. Daniel's voice remained calm, measured, as though he were sitting across from her at the kitchen table. If you're hearing this, then Agnes finally decided the time was right. A soft chuckle followed, one she remembered instantly. The sound hit harder than the words, because memories lived inside voices. Not photographs, not documents, voices, the tape continued. Daniel explained that he had become concerned several weeks before his death. People were watching him, following him, asking questions. He had discovered evidence connected to fraudulent land transfers throughout the valley. Evidence powerful people wanted hidden. He never mentioned violence, never mentioned fear. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, about truth, about choices. The recording wasn't a confession. It wasn't a warning. It was a conversation, the kind a father would have with a daughter. If something happens to me, he said quietly, I want you to know none of this is your burden. Evelyn covered her mouth. Tears rolled freely now. Ranger stood, crossed the room, rested his head gently against her knee. The old shepherd remained perfectly still. Daniel continued. I've had a good life, Evie. Better than most people get. The tape crackled softly. I've watched you grow up. I've watched you become stronger than you realize. Silence followed, then another breath. If this recording reaches you someday, I hope you're happy. The sentence shattered something inside her, because he never got to know, never got to see the years that followed, never met grandchildren, never watched her grow older, never saw any of it. The loss felt enormous again, yet somehow different, less empty. Daniel spoke for nearly 20 minutes, about family, about courage, about protecting people when you have the chance, about doing the right thing even when it costs something. He never sounded angry, never bitter, never afraid, only certain he had chosen correctly. Toward the end of the recording, his voice softened. Tell whoever is sitting beside you that they're a good dog. Evelyn laughed through tears, a surprised laugh, the kind that appears unexpectedly in the middle of sadness. She looked down. Ranger stared back at her, tail thumping once against the floor. Daniel continued. I don't know who that dog is. Another chuckle. But Agnes always liked dogs more than people. The room felt warmer suddenly, lighter. For the first time in days, Evelyn smiled. Then came the final words. The words she would remember forever. If the truth ever comes out, don't spend your life being angry. A pause. A long one. Spend it living. The tape clicked softly, then stopped. Silence filled the room. Evelyn sat motionless. The machine no longer played, yet she continued staring at it, unable to move, unable to speak. Outside, wind moved gently through the pines. Somewhere in the valley, a hawk called. Time passed. Eventually she stood, walked onto the porch and cried. Not the controlled tears she'd carried for years. Not the quiet grief people hide from others. Real tears. The kind that arrive when something locked away finally opens. Ranger remained beside her the entire time. Hours later, she called the Idaho State Police, then county investigators, then an attorney recommended by Ruth McKenna. The response surprised her. Agnes's evidence wasn't being dismissed. It wasn't being ignored. The archive was too extensive, too detailed, too complete. Within days, officials began reviewing the materials. Former investigators were contacted. Records were reopened. Witnesses were located. Old evidence was re-examined. News spread quickly through Black Creek, then through neighboring counties. People talked. Rumors returned. Questions resurfaced. The story everyone thought had ended in 1974 suddenly wasn't over anymore. And at the center of it all stood Warren Hale, the respected ranch owner, the trusted businessman, the community benefactor. His attorneys issued statements. His supporters defended him. But cracks had already begun appearing. The evidence was stronger than anyone expected, far stronger. One afternoon, a television news van appeared in town. Then another. Journalists started asking questions. Questions that hadn't been asked in decades. Questions Agnes Whitmore had spent 50 years preserving. Questions Daniel Harper had died trying to answer. Evelyn watched much of it from the house. Not hiding, simply observing. The attention no longer mattered as much as she expected, because something had changed. The investigation was important. Justice mattered. The truth mattered. But the tape mattered too, perhaps more than anything. One evening, she sat on the porch listening to the recording again. The sun drifted low across the valley. Orange light painted the hills. Ranger rested beside her chair. The old German Aford slept peacefully. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, the mystery no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like closure beginning to take shape. Not complete, not finished, but real. She listened to her father's voice one more time, then looked across the valley. Agnes had spent decades protecting. The silence that once hid the truth was finally breaking apart. And somewhere beyond the mountains, investigators were building a case that would force the entire valley to confront what had happened nearly half a century earlier. This was no longer just a criminal investigation. It was a Fafnir finally finding its way home. Winter arrived gradually in the valley. The first snow came in thin white ribbons drifting across the mountains. The second stayed. By December, the ridges surrounding the property looked as though someone had draped them in clean white blankets. The house Agnes Whitmore had left behind stood quietly beneath the snow. No longer mysterious, no longer threatening, simply waiting. For the first time since Evelyn arrived, it felt less like an inheritance and more like a home. The legal process moved slowly, much slower than television reporters preferred, but steadily. Evidence was verified, documents authenticated, witnesses interviewed, old records re-examined. What Agnes had spent nearly 50 years assembling proved remarkably accurate. Investigators found independent confirmation for nearly every major claim. The land fraud operation, the forged transfers, the hidden partnerships, the financial trail, the cover-up. One discovery led to another, then another. The story grew larger than anyone expected. Several local officials faced scrutiny. Former business associates began cooperating. Long-buried information surfaced from archives, storage rooms, and forgotten filing cabinets. Truth had a strange way of attracting more truth. Eventually, Warren Hale's attorneys stopped speaking about misunderstandings. Then, they stopped speaking altogether. By early spring, the official findings became public. The announcement arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. No dramatic music, no courtroom outburst, no cinematic moment, just facts, carefully documented facts. Daniel Harper's death was formally reclassified. The original accident conclusion was overturned. The investigation acknowledged deliberate actions had contributed to his death. The decades-old case was officially corrected. Evelyn read the statement twice, then a third time. Not because she didn't understand it, because she did. Every word. For nearly 50 years, her father had carried the burden of a false story. Now the record finally reflected the truth. She folded the document, set it down on the kitchen table, and sat quietly. Ranger lay nearby, older now, a little slower than when they first arrived. His muzzle carried more gray. His naps lasted longer, but his eyes remained the same, bright, watchful, faithful. The old German shepherd lifted his head and studied her, as if checking whether she was all right. Evelyn smiled. "I think we did it." His tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, sunlight reflected off melting snow. The valley was beginning to wake from winter. Weeks later, she stood in the small cemetery where Daniel Harper had been buried for nearly half a century. The ceremony wasn't large. She hadn't wanted one. A few family members attended. Several local residents came quietly. Ruth McKenna stood near the back. Even Curtis Vance appeared, older, more reflective, less certain than the man who once tried convincing her to leave. A new marker had been placed beside Daniel's grave, not replacing the original, adding to it, correcting it. The inscription was simple. Daniel Harper, beloved father, truth found at last. The mountain wind moved gently through the pines surrounding the cemetery. No speeches followed. None were necessary. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. Afterward, Evelyn remained behind, standing alone beside the grave, or almost alone. Ranger sat beside her, the same way he had sat beside her throughout the entire journey. The same way he had sat beside her through every discovery, every disappointment, every breakthrough, every memory. She reached down and rested a hand on his neck. The old shepherd leaned slightly against her leg, not seeking attention, simply being present, just as he always had been. Months passed. Life settled into a new rhythm. The reporters eventually left. The news cycle moved on. The public found newer stories. The valley returned to normal, but not entirely. Some changes remained. Property records were corrected. Public land disputes were revisited. Families who had lived with unanswered questions found answers. And the house Agnes Whitmore had protected for decades began changing too. Evelyn repaired the porch first, then the roof, then several broken windows. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just steady work. The kind of work that transforms a place one piece at a time. Her daughter visited often. Grandchildren eventually followed. The house that once felt isolated slowly filled with life. Laughter returned. Voices echoed through rooms that had remained silent for years. The kitchen became busy again. Coffee cups accumulated beside the sink. Boots appeared by the front door. Family photographs replaced dust-covered corners. The house no longer guarded secrets. It held memories. One afternoon, in late summer, Evelyn discovered herself standing in the exact place where she had first entered the property months earlier. The front door, the strange door with no keys. She looked at it for a long moment, then laughed softly. The entire mystery had begun there. A house no one could unlock. A will that made no sense. A dead relative she barely remembered. At the time it had felt impossible. Now it felt inevitable. As though Agnes had understood something Evelyn hadn't. That the truth needed exactly the right person, and exactly the right time, and perhaps exactly the right dog. That evening, the sunset stretched across the valley in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Evelyn sat on the porch, a blanket draped across her lap, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Ranger rested beside her. The old shepherd slept peacefully. Occasionally one ear twitched, nothing more. The valley spread before them, quiet, beautiful, honest. For a long time she simply watched the fading light, thinking, remembering, not dwelling on the pain, not dwelling on the injustice, just remembering her father, Agnes, the years between, the journey that brought her here. She thought about the tape recording, the sound of Daniel's voice, the final conversation they never truly had, and she realized something. The inheritance had never been the house. Not really. The house was only the path. The real inheritance had been the truth. The chance to finally understand. The chance to finish a story that should have been finished decades earlier. Beside her, Ranger opened one eye briefly, then settled back down, satisfied, as if his work was finally complete. The sun disappeared beyond the mountains. The first evening stars appeared. Lights glowed warmly through the windows behind her. Family would arrive soon for dinner. Voices would fill the house. Life would continue. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The cool evening air carried the scent of pine and distant earth. Peace settled around her, not the absence of sadness, something deeper. Acceptance. The silence that had haunted her family for nearly 50 years was gone. The questions were gone. The uncertainty was gone. Only the truth remained. And with it came something she had never expected to find at 70 years old. Not revenge, not victory, not wealth, peace. Truth often survives longer than the people who try to bury it. The people we love may leave this world, but their courage, choices, and sacrifices continue shaping lives long after they are gone. Sometimes healing begins not when we forget the past, but when we finally understand it. And as darkness settled gently across the valley, Evelyn Harper sat beside the dog who had led her to the answers, watching the lights of her home glow against the mountains, grateful that after all those years, the silence had finally ended. And as darkness settled gently across the valley, Evelyn Harper sat beside the dog who had led her to the answers, watching the lights of her home glow against the mountains, grateful that after all those years, the silence had finally ended. Ranger was asleep now. His gray muzzle rested across his paws, rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Evelyn looked at him and thought about how none of this had started with evidence. It had started with a dog refusing to walk away from a stone wall, then a hidden room, then a tunnel, then a voice she hadn't heard since she was a young woman. Every person in that valley had looked at the same mountains for decades. They had driven the same roads, passed the same fields, heard the same story about a hunting accident. But Ranger hadn't cared about the story. He cared about what was there.
What was hidden, what didn't belong. And because he keeps stopping, because he keeps digging, because he keeps existing, our daughter finally learned who her father truly was. For most of her life, Evelyn thought the hardest part of losing Daniel Harper. She understood now that the harder thing had been living without knowing why. The two hadn't brought him back. It hadn't given her those missing years, but it gave something back to him. His name, his choice, his courage. The porch lay low behind her. Laughter drifted through an open window from inside the house. Family voices, familiar voices. The kind her father never got the chance to hear. Evelyn smiled toward the darkness beyond the valley. Then she reached down and rested her hand gently on Ranger's shoulder. And for a moment she wondered how many truths are still waiting in this world because no one has trusted the one loyal soul trying to lead them there.